Snow never truly falls in silence. It carries a hush, a secret weight. In the far bend of a frost-bitten valley, where winter outlives most men, stood a small log cabin half buried in powder. Smoke crawled from its chimney in a thin silver ribbon, like a prayer hesitant to rise. Inside lived Anora, 22, a woman the town believed mute by nature, not by sorrow. They were wrong. Her silence was not emptiness. It was resignation hardened into habit. She had once spoken freely, back when laughter felt simple and grief had not yet claimed names she loved. But tragedy carved its own genealogy inside her, stripping family first, then voice, until language felt like a door that led nowhere. The townsfolk mistook her quiet for mystery, or worse, guilt. Their assumptions became stories, and their stories became verdicts. The silent wild woman. The lone ghost in the pines. The one misfortune walks beside. Anora endured their labels the way the earth endures snow, without protest, with quiet endurance. She lived far enough to remain unseen, close enough to stay unsettled. Every morning she rose before the sun, fed the fire, and gathered the world one small chore at a time. Fetching water crusted with ice, stitching worn hides, watering the memory of a life she no longer spoke about. Each movement carried intention, a life built not on voice, but ritual. She did not ask to be understood. She asked only to remain untouched. Winter that year was not merely cold, it was a grief. Even wolves tread carefully beneath such skies. Dusk arrived early, violet-stained and unforgiving, swallowing heat and sound alike. Anora stood by the window, lantern in hand, light illuminating the sharp plane of her cheekbones, her long black braid coiled over one shoulder like a guarded secret. She watched snow claim the horizon in patient, drifting shrouds. Then came footstep, not hurried, not sneaking, heavy, deliberate, and carrying a rhythm that told of a man accustomed to long roads and spoken truths. Each step compacted snow with a weight that felt impossibly sure, impossibly close. Anora's breath stayed steady, trained by a lifetime of self-possession. She did not reach for fear. Fear had grown tired of waiting for her surrender long ago. A knock, gentle but firm. Skin against wood. A request, not a threat. The door opened to a figure cut from winter's harsher materials, tall beyond expectation, broad-shouldered, unvarnished by vanity. Boone Carter, 30 years of weather and wandering etched into him. Shirtless despite the storm, as though cold itself had learned not to argue with him. Snow clung to his dark hair, his skin marked with thin pale scars that told of past battles fought quietly, without witnesses. His eyes, though, were startling, brown, warm, unguarded in a way big men rarely allow themselves. He tipped his hat slightly, an economy of politeness. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, edged with gravel but not hostility, "can I stay here tonight?" He did not ask why she lived alone, nor how she survived without a man's presence beside her. He did not flinch at her silence. He did not fill it. He simply waited inside it, comfortable in its shape. Most visitors arrived with curiosity tucked like a blade in their coat. Boone arrived with nothing but need and honesty. Anora stepped aside. It was not a welcome spoken, but a welcome unmistakable. Inside, warmth was sparse but sincere. The cabin carried the scent of cedar, smoke, and isolated endurance. One small table, 2 chairs, pelts neatly folded, jars of dried herbs suspended from rafters. A bed pushed to the far wall. No decoration. Nothing loud. Survival distilled into simplicity. Boone removed his boots before crossing the threshold, an act so natural it felt ceremonial. Snow melted into small reluctant puddles at his feet. He scanned nothing longer than courtesy required. No judgment. No pity. No appraisal. Silence settled between them, not tense, but intentional, 2 strangers sharing the same fire without claiming ownership of one another's air. She poured water into a tin cup and placed it before him. He nodded once, picking it up with a quiet reverence, like receiving communion from winter itself. No theatrics. No bravado. Just mutual recognition that need does not shame the honest. He drank. She stoked the fire. The cabin listened. Outside, wind tested the walls like a persistent rumor. Inside, warmth held its ground, fragile but undefeated. Boone sat with his back leaning against the log beam near the hearth, leaving the bed respectfully unassumed. The fire painted amber along his shoulders, flickering as though undecided whether to warm him or ask his story. "You don't talk much," he said. Not unkindly, not curiously, but as one might observe rain. Anora did not stiffen. She did not flinch. She simply looked toward the flames, eyes reflecting old loss and newer resilience. Boone continued, gaze ahead, giving her the courtesy of not demanding eye contact. "That's fine by me. World's loud enough as it is." It was the closest thing to acceptance she had heard in years. Hours passed not like emptiness but like snowfall, gradual, enveloping, meaningful without announcement. At one point, the fire cracked sharply, splitting a log with a bright fracture of sparks. Anora watched how Boone did not reach for alarm, only adjustment. His calm was not a performance. It was bone-deep. She noticed the faint tremor in his left thumb when he thought no one was watching, an old injury, a reminder that even mountains fracture. He noticed the nearly invisible tension in her shoulders when wind slapped the shutters, an echo of a night she once could not outlast. Empathy passed between them without needing the ferry of speech. When sleep began to claim the edges of awareness, Boone closed his eyes where he sat. No demand for space. No negotiation of comfort. Simply a man trusting the world to stay civilized long enough for rest. Anora watched him a while. His breathing deepened, steady and unguarded. She should have felt invaded or at minimum wary. Yet her pulse found no reason to sharpen. Something unfamiliar bloomed at the ribs. Not excitement, not hope, but possibility, small and cautious as a candle flame learning it can exist without wind's permission. She stood softly, lifted a fur blanket, and draped it over his shoulders. Not charity. Not gratitude. Reciprocity. Then she returned to the window, watching snow bury the footprints that had led him here, erasing the road but not the encounter. For the first time in years, her silence did not feel imposed. It felt shared. She whispered then, barely a breath shaped into meaning, spoken not for him, nor for the room, but for the version of herself she feared was long dead. "Stay." The word dissolved into night before it could be claimed. Yet it lingered all the same. The fire cracked once more, softer this time, like a page turning. Outside, snow kept falling, patient, steady, insistent that nothing, not even grief, remains frozen forever. And in that quiet certainty, dawn began gathering its light. Dawn broke with a fragile pink hue that shimmered over the snow-covered valley, melting the night's hush with reluctant warmth. Inside the cabin, Anora moved quietly, hands steady over the fire. Steam rose from the kettle like a fragile promise. Boone stirred on the floor near the hearth, his eyes half-lidded, body still massive but softened by sleep. The room smelled of smoke and pine and something more intangible, a cautious companionship. He did not speak. She did not ask him to. Words were optional here. Presence was not. She set a simple meal before him, the tin plates clinking softly against the wooden table. Boone picked up his cup, tilting it toward her in a small gesture of thanks. She inclined her head, acknowledging the exchange with nothing more than a quiet breath. The snow outside had continued overnight, leaving a pristine blanket that hid tracks, erased paths, and suggested new beginnings. Boone rose and moved to the window, letting his large hands brush frost from the glass, revealing the sun's tentative light. "Didn't think you'd let me stay past sunrise," he murmured, voice rough but gentle, carrying no challenge, only observation. Anora did not answer. She did not need to. Her eyes, steady and knowing, said enough. Silence was their shared language, layered with trust that words could not contain. She watched as Boone's gaze drifted over the valley, noting how he moved not like a visitor but like a man recalibrating himself to a world long abandoned. She sensed in him the same careful solitude she had cultivated for years, a life lived with cautious expectation that no one would stay. Days passed like slow-moving rivers, time marked by the quiet rhythm of domestic rituals. Boone repaired the cabin's roof when snow weakened its beams, moved logs into place for warmth, and carried water from the frozen stream without complaint. Anara left small gestures of care, a folded blanket, tea waiting at the hearth, a dry cloth by the door. Neither announced gratitude, neither demanded acknowledgment. It was enough that the acts existed, that their lives intersected without fanfare or assertion. The town, oblivious to nuance, soon murmured of the pair. Whispered warnings and speculative tales drifted through the narrow streets, catching on frosted eaves and drifting into empty saloons. "Seen the giant with the silent woman," said one. "She'll bring him trouble," said another. Boone did not flinch at rumors. Anara felt the judgment less now, softened by his indifference. They were no longer merely surviving, they were recalibrating what it meant to live with dignity, even under scrutiny. One morning, as snow thickened and winds cut across the valley with sharper teeth, Sheriff Hollis arrived, concern in his eyes rather than malice. The townsfolk had spread alarm at seeing the pair together, fearing impropriety, fearing change. Boone stepped outside to meet the lawman, chest bare, standing steady against the cold as if the snow itself respected his presence. Hollis spoke, voice low, "They fear what they don't understand." Boone's reply was deliberate, measured, and without pride. "Then let them learn." There was no confrontation, only an unspoken agreement that some truths do not need explaining. Hollis left, the wind carrying his doubts away, leaving the cabin as it had always been, a small island where silence and trust could flourish. Inside, the routine of quiet companionship deepened. Boone carved notches into a fence outside the cabin, counting the days of snow, while Anara spun fibers into yarn, her fingers nimble and purposeful. He noticed the slight tension in her shoulders when wind rattled the shutters and responded not with question but with steady presence, moving to secure them without ceremony. She observed how he hesitated when lifting heavy logs, scars along his ribs flexing with effort, and felt a quiet recognition of shared endurance. Connection grew not in grand declarations but in these small attentions, gestures carried without expectation, each reinforcing the bond neither had yet named. Months passed with snow alternately soft and merciless. One night, the storm that had loomed for days finally struck with its full force. Wind whipped across the valley, hurling flurries against the cabin with a relentless, unyielding fury. Horses in nearby stalls panicked. Trees bent under the weight of ice and snow. The town faced uncertainty, but the cabin stood firm because Boone had reinforced every joist, every log, every fragile promise. A group of townsmen arrived at the door in desperation, seeking refuge from the storm. Their initial skepticism dissolved when faced with the steadfast walls Boone had built and the small figure of Anara who met them without fear. She opened the door fully, standing tall and calm, snow swirling around her like a veil. Her voice, clear and deliberate, carried across the wind, "Come inside." It was not a command nor a plea. It was acknowledgment of human fragility and the power of mercy, the rebirth of courage and choice. The men entered, awed not by heroics, but by the quiet authority of a woman who had spent years shaping strength from silence. Boone stood behind her, broad and protective, yet deferential to the new center of gravity, the woman whose silence had become a language and whose actions now guided them all. After the storm passed, spring crept into the valley. Snow melted into streams, and the cabin, weathered but unbroken, became a home stitched with intention. Anara and Boone moved not in haste or ceremony but with the slow certainty of understanding. They married quietly, the ceremony their own. Hands intertwined, breath shared, eyes acknowledging years of endurance and courage. Love was not a spectacle. It was the steady warmth that survived cold, wind, and solitude. In the mornings, they watched the sunrise together. In the evenings, they tended fire and hearth, spoke only when necessary, and understood each other in gestures that required no explanation. Their lives, once fractured and solitary, now carried the weight of shared survival, dignity, and trust. The valley no longer seemed indifferent. Snow melted into fertile ground, carrying seeds for renewal, just as their companionship carried hope for a future neither could have imagined alone. Anara's voice, long dormant, emerged not in grand pronouncement but in quiet affirmation. Boone's presence, once transient, became rooted in devotion. Together, they learned that resilience is cultivated not in solitude alone, but in the gentle bravery of presence and care. Words, when finally spoken, were less necessary than the acts that had preceded them: tending fire, securing roofs, folding blankets, offering refuge. Some nights, long after the day's labor ended, Anara would whisper to the stars, recounting the moment Boone asked to stay. "Stay," she had said, and it had been more than permission. It had been the first beat of a life she could claim for herself. Boone, hearing the quiet, understood its weight. Their journey was proof that silence can carry love, that small acts can speak louder than any words, and that the most enduring storms are those weathered together. And so, in the valley where snow once fell like unspoken sorrow, two lives intertwined quietly, fully, and irrevocably. They built a home from wood and warmth, from gestures and trust, from patience and steady hands. In the end, survival became more than endurance. It became a life filled with peace, connection, and love, each day a quiet testament to the courage of hearts willing to remain, willing to care, and willing to stand together when the storm arrived. The story concludes, yet the valley continues to whisper its lesson. Some hearts are healed not by loud words, but by steady presence, by gentle bravery, and by the quiet choice to stay when all else is uncertain.